This is the second of the Arkansas chats. I'm going to talk a little bit about book history. Hall identifies four themes impacting colonial book history: the Protestant Reformation, mechanisms regulating printing, mercantile capitalism, and the impact of imports. The first is the Protestant Reformation. Now, we saw when we were looking at this in Britain that many of the Protestants there saw printing as related in a positive way to literacy and also to getting away from the papists. One of the reasons that printing grew so popularly was vernacular, but another was the fact that these people could get all of their own versions of the Bible printed out, and they could get their devotionals and their psalters and all the different kinds of religious books that they wanted people to read and pay attention to. Excuse me. The Protestant clergy saw printing as supporting their efforts, and so I think that there was a bit of underwriting that went on to printing that came from the clergy themselves. They also saw print as stabilizing messages so that they could be transmitted across distances. This meant that when they came to this country, they could also use print to get back to the people who were still relatives or clergymen or mentors that were still living in England. So they were able to use print itself as a way to make sure that they were interpreting the Lord's Word in the way that the church that they were following wanted them to. Now, thinking of this as westward expansion as well, they also felt that print itself was an instrument to allow them to expand to the West and still be tied to the Lord's teaching and not lose it. So I think that getting the word exactly right was tied to printing in a way that was both underpinning the Protestant religion and allowing for a kind of diversity in the colonies that you wouldn't have had if you didn't have these different ways to stay connected to other people who were at distances from you. The second one of the points that are made by Hall, that there were mechanisms for regulating printing. We can look at the Licensing Act of 1662. One of the things that was involved in that was that if you wrote a book, you had to turn it into the licensing agency, and then they would look at it and say, okay, you can print that book. This led many of the printers to use European or already successful print versions that had come out in Britain instead of printing new things in the colonies. So that's one of the reasons that there weren't immediately a lot of new kind of printed documents because they were having to get this accepted through the licensing agency in Britain. They had the Copyright Act of Anne in 1710 as well to deal with, so that you could copy something if you paid the original author. This meant that it was a lot easier to handle these kinds of off prints. The other thing was that because England worried about sedition, they were particularly persnickety about what the colonists were saying. It was much safer to print something that was already accepted by the Licensing Act and the Licensing Bureau and had its own copyright, and you just licensed doing a new edition, than it was to actually go through the trouble of and the time of getting something new through this whole set of bureaucracy. A third kind of contextual factor that was at work, that also at work in the colonial America, was that mercantile capitalism needed a labor force. It was usually indentured servants. Not only were they expensive, they were people who would drive up the cost of printing so that you actually needed a lot more sponsorship to bring out a printed book. In the last chat, I made the point that only about 75% of what was printed in a print run would sell. So you knew that you were not going to make a huge amount of money after the first 2 years that something was printed. You had to make your hay while you could. It meant that printing itself was not self-sustaining. You needed sponsorships. This is not new. Many of the printers in England had patrons. When the scientific printing got going in this country, they got money from the Royal Society to get printing done. The government started giving money to have different kinds of government documents printed. The church also would sponsor different hymnals that they wanted, or different kinds of little devotional pamphlets, and they would make those up for the schools, and that would be a way that printers got money as well. As we went along, there was heightened consumerism, so there was an expanding market, and that helped with giving a sense of book. If you called a pamphlet a book, there were many more people who could afford a pamphlet than could afford a leather-bound book. So there was also cheaper sources of materials. If you used paper pulp rather than rags, you actually had cheaper paper. Now, that was not something that was very happy to the British, but that was the cheaper paper was used in the United States. The fourth kind of contextual feature that Hall saw was the impact of imports. It wasn't just the colonists were buying books that were printed in the colonies. They also were buying books that were printed in Europe. This is true of not just books printed in England, but also in other countries. There was a very active German book fair system. That's the way they marketed their books, was to have fairs. And so there were printers in the U.S. who would go to the European fairs and buy German books, French books, Italian books, bring them back and sell them to collectors. So you had a lot of imports that would come in and would also be competition to the colonial books. There also was pocket editions of classics. The Europeans had figured out how to cram a lot of text into a pocket-sized edition. So this octavo format was popular, and a lot of the college schoolboys would have octavo pocket classics that they would carry around. They were very popular among the collegers. So what happened is that because of the regulation, there was a lot of European authors that were used and printed in the colonies. They were also imported. They imported the presses because the presses were not built here. They might have been assembled here, but they were not built here. The paper a lot of times was brought from Europe, and also the typefaces. So this became something that imports were very important to the printing of the print culture. The other kinds of print culture arguments that Hall goes through in his discussion with Amory is that there were 5 different kinds of print culture arguments that swirl around the book history kind of scene. The first has to do with the relationship of orality, print, and writing. Ong is one of the ones that talks about this quite extensively. What his position is that as print makes us more precise in what we say, the presence of the word declines. Writing thus leads to analytic categories that are hierarchically arranged. There's a book by Arbach called Mimesis, and one of the things that he stresses is that oral societies tend to arrange their songs using paratactic structure as a string of pearls, whereas when you get to a written culture, it uses hypotactic structure, so it's very hierarchical. This fits in with Ramus. This fits in with the Enlightenment division of everything into twos. and their love of treeing everything. A second point about orality printing culture that comes from Levi-Strauss is that writing is a form of power, and this power overcame the authority of speech. So when writing took hold, what happens is that speech becomes less powerful. Now, that's a bit not true for sermons, because sermons, even though they're written at this time, are very much judged based on the power of their delivery. So there's a kind of authority of the oral that stays in the sermonic. Many postmoderns also argue that stable text is a kind of dead letter and living speech is demonic. And that becomes an argument that print culture has to deal with. And the fourth thing that he gives as a kind of interactive kind of argument that we'll run into is that speech or writing will be privileged at different times, or privileged differently in a given time. Use the sermons as an example. They're written out, but when they're spoken, they're privileged. The second kind of interaction between book history and print culture that Hall talks about is the relationship of literacy and illiteracy. One of the things that he notes is that many people think of literacy as a skill, a possession, or a technology, whereas he and Amory in their work on book history consider a practice. But they also are very nervous about the fact that we tend to see literacy and project literacy onto the past in the way that we are literate ourselves. So our own views of what literacy is and what it means are the views that we project into the past. I think this is a good kind of worry to have, because this is a historian's problem to always be thinking that the way we see something is the way it is, and that people from the past thought the same way we do. A third thing that he points out is that print also has a connection to public sphere, that it abets the construction of a bourgeois public sphere, to use Habermas's categories. It also foments sedition, which the British understood we would not have had an American Revolution without print, because that was the only way the colonists were able to build a kind of connection between themselves. The authorship and intellectual property issues come up because this becomes a time they consider the birth of the author. As you had copyright, you could own a book. You could make a book and own a book. And that was one of the great things of the Enlightenment. The last point that he brings up is that there was a reading revolution. And one of the things that happened is that it happened really with women because they had been the biggest audience for the devotional. And when the novel came along, they sort of switched. They stopped reading the devotionals as much and started reading novels. So this revolution was a very important part of the change in the way we thought about what writing did. It wasn't just something that preserved our religion and our religious ideas. It wasn't just something that uh, kept records. It wasn't just something that kept track of the laws. It wasn't just something that was used for science. It was something that was used to entertain us. And as we start growing this consumer society, the entertainment department of writing becomes important.